Well, thank you very much, and I see we're on our own.
Me and you, baby.
And me and you, baby. Let me start out by saying that I apologize that this is not a balanced panel. You all have basically the same message, and we should have had at least one person to present the other perspective, and we did not. And I'm concerned about that. And yeah, when I'm here, there's so much one can do on my own. Okay. So with me, let me first apologize about that, because I don't believe this is a balanced panel. And I'll just have to say, you all are intellectuals and you all are good sources of information, but we need to juxtapose your arguments with someone else. And we didn't do it, and so we failed. And maybe we'll have another hearing where the points that you've made, you can have 2 or 3 of you, and maybe someone on the other side who could tell us, refute some of the points that have been made. So with that said, let me just go into a few, hopefully, some questions that'll be provocative questions anyway. I did ask for specific military aggression and acts there that would, I didn't seem to get any, frankly. I hear about the massing of 300,000 troops in Russian territory, and Russia is an act of aggression against their neighboring countries, but amassing NATO troops and tanks in their neighboring countries on their border is not aggression. Talk about a double standard. I would think that that is a major double standard. I will have to say that with my friend, my fellow journalist, a former journalist as I am, that I believe that the idea of declaring the Baltics like to be similar to Berlin demonstrates a basic perceptual problem of why we are heading towards in the wrong direction. And that is, the Cold War is over. As long as we are thinking about Russia as the way it was during that time period, and others, and Berlin, West Berlin, as being threatened as it was at that time, in a government that was controlled by the Communist Party, that was an ideological-based party that wanted to create Marxist, atheist dictatorships throughout the world, replace democracies with Marxist dictatorships. That is not the world we live in today, and it's not the Russia. Russia is different than what it was. Now, how different? Let me just ask this. When we haven't, again, I asked for some specific things in the Baltics. I know there was a cyber attack, which someone brought up. I'd like to ask about that cyber attack in Estonia. If you know about this, I'm sure you should. There was a cyber attack when the Russians and the Estonians got into a personality match when the Estonians said, we're going to take down this statue that is dedicated to the Russian soldiers who gave their lives in liberating the Baltics from the Nazis. And at that point, there was a massive cyber attack which really did very extensive, and it was a heavy-duty attack by Russia on Estonia. How long ago did that happen? What year was that? When was it?
2007, sir.
2007. And since that time, have there been any attacks of that magnitude in the Baltics? Any other attacks since 2007? Now, I will tell you, we have heard over and over and over again about the incredible cyber attacks, and that was 2007, and there was that, I'm not excusing the fact somebody's insulting, France insulted us a number of times, and we didn't get so angry at them that we punished them, and some people, there's all sorts of stories about that. And what about when we were talking about their 300,000 is a threat, but our NATO 30,000 aren't. Is the panel aware that part of those NATO exercises, and there's been a number of them now, part of that has been B-52 flights from England headed and then turning around at the Russian border? Is anyone here not consider that a provocative act?
I do not.
You do not? Okay, so you think a nuclear weapons delivery system aimed at the heart of Russia and then turning around right on the border is not hostile and provocative?
It might be if they weren't doing the same thing to us. They are flying Bear and Blackjack bombers off the coast of Alaska around the outer edges of Europe. So the flights are
That is not the same. Let me just note, what you're saying is ridiculous. It is not the same as aiming a flight of bombers into the capital areas, meaning St. Petersburg and Moscow, versus flying along a coast. Everybody has a right to fly along someone's coast. And in fact, what's fascinating is, now let me ask you this, are there also ships as part of those exercises that we had? Did we have any nuclear weapons capability of carrying ships that were part of that? You didn't even know that? Well, yes, there were. So now tell me, if we actually are bringing nuclear weapons delivery systems to the Russian border, you don't believe that's provocative. Does anyone else here agree with that?
Sir,
yes, go right ahead.
Can I respond to that? I think one has to look at this over a period of say, 10 years. Say we start in 2004, when we've expanded NATO and we've built quite good relations with Russia through the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council. Things have deteriorated since then, but in each case, the deterioration has started with actions on the Russian side and been followed by much smaller actions on ours. Now, you mentioned nuclear weapons, and this is an extremely important point. Russia has a very large arsenal of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and these are integrated into its military doctrine and integrated into its exercises. And they practice getting these nuclear artillery shells, depth charges, short-range weapons out of the bunkers onto delivery systems. And they do this again and again and again. We in the West have almost given up on tactical nuclear weapons. We have very few. Those that we have are kept a very long way away from the Baltic states, chiefly in bunkers in the Netherlands. Our exercises do not involve those use. It's a specific part of Russian military doctrine to do what they call escalate to de-escalate, which means if they think they are losing a conventional war, they will go nuclear. And they make no secret about that. And they talk about these nuclear weapons all the time in a way that the neighbours find terrifying. Not just the NATO members. They say this to the Finns and to the Swedes. You mentioned B-52 flights. I don't know whether you're aware of what happened on Good Friday 2014, I think it was, when a Russian flight carried out a dummy attack on Stockholm and on another very important military target in Sweden, at a time when the Swedish Air Force had taken the weekend off because it was Easter. They had to scramble Danish fighters from Lithuania to intercept these Russians. In my country...
So the Russian planes,
may I just finish?
And the incident you're describing, they actually penetrated...
no, they turned around at the last minute. And we also had a similar event in... And if you penetrate someone's airspace...
So they turned around at the last moment. You remember that, and you condemn that, but you don't condemn U.S. B-52 bombers and nuclear weapons carrying ships going right to the Russian border?
I think it's very important that the Russians are trying to make us think that we have no nuclear deterrence. And they've said, and they say privately and publicly, they don't believe that NATO deterrence works. And so long as NATO is a nuclear alliance, we have to show that we are nuclear capable. Now, we have many gaps on the escalation ladder. We can't match...
Sir, I would just have to add that I believe it demonstrates a double standard that will give the Russians a message that we are judging our behavior differently than we're judging yours.
Can I respond to that, sir?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry we don't have other witnesses here to make these points, and I'm going to have to give it to him, but I will let you answer that, and then we have to...
I just wanted to respond to your point about West Berlin, sir.
Yes.
You said the Cold War is over, and it's true, the old Cold War is over, but as I said in my opening remarks, Russia is trying to change the rules. Russia doesn't like the way the world operates at the moment. It doesn't like American leadership. It doesn't like the Atlantic Alliance. It doesn't like multilateral rules-based organizations like the EU. And that is a threat. It's not the same as the Soviet Union, it's much weaker, but the symbolic bastion of the West is the Baltic states, because they are militarily vulnerable.
Okay.
And in that sense, I think it's very similar to West Berlin.
Well, let me just note that Great Britain seems to not like the EU either, do they? People of Great Britain decided they might not like that as well. And yeah, the institutions that were created during the Cold War are beginning to not evaporate, but to readjust, and some of them will disappear, some of them will remain strong. But this isn't the Cold War. Look, again, let me just remind you, you're looking at the ultimate Cold Warrior here. I mean, this is not some guy who, did not believe we should confront the Soviet Union. And I was deeply involved with that for 20 years of my life, actually 30 years of my life. And I find, well, anyway, we'll have a second round of questions. There's only two of us.
Chairman,
but
would it be possible before you move on to add something on the nuclear?
with permission from my
Yeah, I was going to give you the...
Okay, I appreciate that. I just feel badly because I think I was invited to try to elucidate Russian thinking, and the conclusion of much of my research into Russian analysis and the statements of Russian leaders and the disposition of Russian forces has been that while there are real causes for concern, and that's why I broke it into that three-part analysis of motive, capability, and opportunity, that nonetheless we are not facing an acute, immediate Russian military threat to the Baltic states. And there are two principal reasons for that on the military side. Speaking about nuclear deterrence, one is that nuclear deterrence works. And the Russian sources I looked at were very clear that that's a big part of the reason why they wouldn't under any circumstances so assume plenty of other motives potentially to intervene in the Baltic states. The fact that you're talking about intervening against members of a nuclear-armed alliance makes that, I mean, the Russian sources are very clear. They have no desire to provoke that, and there are certainly plenty of other targets that would be more desirable. The second issue, and I made this point very quickly before, and I do encourage you to take a look at my written remarks as well, is this issue of disposition, of location, that even if kind of politically and psychologically the Baltic states may have a similar resonance to West Berlin today, they're in a different spot on the map. They are just a couple hundred kilometers away from St. Petersburg. They're, in the case of Lithuania, actually bordering on Kaliningrad on a heavily militarized Russian exclave. And so what that means is there's a certain amount of Russian military activity we're just going to see. We're going to keep seeing it, and it's sort of normal that we would see it because that's where Russia's population is and that's where their assets are. So I think that's why, in terms of context, I think it's very important that we interpret Russia's actions and threats, not with charity, but in the context in which they are actually taking place and not in a sort of fear-laden fever dream kind of politicized context. That would be my only...
And Mr. Meeks, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that the committee would love to have maybe General Flynn or Paul Manafort come to testify, because they will have the opposite, they will hear their point of view. They may be great witnesses.